Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So this past week, there were municipal elections in British Columbia, and it's fascinating, some of the reports, particularly the reports that are comparing what's happening in BC versus what's not happening, it would appear, in Ontario. And the reports are that there was not a wholesale, but almost a wholesale change where incumbents lost and new people were elected. And it's people that are, it would appear, far more public safety oriented, number one, and number two, far more housing oriented, and worried about affordable housing. And, you know, frankly, safety and affordable housing are issues in Ontario. And so it's interesting why people in BC became so disgruntled with municipal city politicians, ousted a lot of them, including almost the majority of the city of Vancouver and the mayor, and installed brand new people to try to have action. And yet, you know, most of the reports about what's going on in Toronto and Ontario are that people aren't running and incumbents are going to win and are sleepwalking to the job. And so I thought it would be really helpful to reach out to Sara MacIntyre, who is a political commentator, a political advisor. She's former communications person for Christy Clark, former premier of British Columbia, also worked for Stephen Harper in Ottawa. She lives in White Rock in the Vancouver area. And I thought it would be interesting to check in with her, what happened, why it happened, and sort of maybe try to compare it to what's going on in Ontario. So Sara, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
So tell us a little bit about what happened. I understand, like Vancouver, they actually have political parties, and a new political party and a new mayor won 7 out of like 10 or so council spots and have got a majority and can change things fairly dramatically, as one example of what's changed.
Yeah, of course, like everything in British Columbia, it's always a little bit different. And so there are organized political parties at the municipal election level. Generally, it's always a coalition of voices, those that are on, right of center and those that are left of center. So those that are union backed and backed by the Greens, and then those that are backed by business and small business owners. Traditionally, those two parties were the NPA, which I think stood for the Nonpartisan Association, and Vision in Vancouver. And in the last election, the NPA kind of imploded. They had been around for quite a while, and everything is cyclical in politics. You have so much power for so often, and then that kind of collapses. And now this new party that's headed by Mayor-elect Ken Sim is called ABC Party, which is a Better City party. I just found out actually yesterday morning what ABC stood for.
I think it's great. A Better City sounds good.
Yeah, it does. And so they had a total of 15 candidates that were on the ballot yesterday or on Saturday, and every single one that they put forward won. So some of them were on Parks Board, some were on school trustees, and then the Vancouver City Council as well.
Every single one.
Every single candidate they put forward won.
Fantastic. Yeah. That's incredible. And tell me, why did this happen?
Well, I think, it was just things in Vancouver. They're the perennial issues of, as you mentioned at your outset, public safety and affordability and housing. And, the Kennedy Stewart won the last election in 2018 just by a slim majority. Like, it was less than 1,000 votes between him and Ken Sim last election. So the mayor that won this term ran in the last election and lost by less than 1,000 votes, I think it was. But it's just the typical election swings, right? And I think people have felt that the safety issue downtown has really gotten out of control, and that a lot of the policy measures that had been promised to deliver changes in the last election didn't, and in fact it got much worse. Now, why that is, we can debate that, but one of the main planks that Ken Sim ran on was hiring 100 police officers right off the bat. So, the big 3 items he promised in his first 100 days of office was 100 new police hires and 100 new mental health nurses to be hired, as well as rezoning to expedite housing starts and residential developments. So if you drive through Vancouver, and, I'm just back into BC after being away for a number of years. And, it's always been tough on the east side. I'm not going to say that it was great 15 years ago, but I will say, I was having a luncheon downtown, and I had to come in through Powell Street. And as a Canadian, it was heartbreaking. There's just blocks and blocks and blocks of people that are vulnerable, that are addicted, that have mental health issues. The streets are filthy. You can't drive more than 20 kilometers an hour because people are just kind of zombieing in and out of traffic. And this is in the most beautiful city in the world.
So I as I told you at the outset before we started, I was in Vancouver this summer. I was also in Victoria. I was also in Nanaimo. I was also in Surrey and Langford and a couple of other smaller towns. And I travel a fair amount across Canada and across North America for business. I've never seen as many street people in my whole life, not in New York, not anywhere, as I saw in Vancouver and Victoria.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, and it feels like, for people that I think live here, it's almost, they don't see them as people anymore. I don't mean to make Vancouverites sound cold-hearted, but the problem's just been there for so long that I don't think they realize how jarring it is for someone from a different part of the country to come here and walk through or drive through those few blocks. And I think the pandemic and lockdown exacerbated a lot of mental health issues and addiction issues. We've heard that time and time again from public health officials, that social isolation and the things that lockdown measures brought about and exacerbated. You're seeing that in the most vulnerable populations, and so you're seeing the numbers much more prevalent in places like Victoria and Vancouver, where you can live almost all year round outside. So I think there is that piece of the public safety, which is the homelessness and mental health and addictions issue. But there's also the other side of public safety issues right now. And it came up again and again during the election campaign, which is this kind of revolving door of serial offenders. There was the case, I don't know if you remember, just the beginning of the pandemic, where this couple was in a coffee shop and they started uttering racial slurs at this Chinese couple that owned this place, and ended up spilling their coffee on them. They were brought up actually on charges and were being sentenced this past week. And there's a lot of these kind of random stranger attacks with knives, and they seem to be almost daily. You're getting reports from somewhere in the Lower Mainland where somebody has been attacked by, just walking down the street, being stalked by a male that's obviously got some mental health issues, and hitting a woman in the face. That was 2 weeks ago. And they seem to be happening quite often. And it's gotten up to where in the provincial legislature, they're looking at having the Attorney General actually do an issuance to the police about not releasing or processing bail for serial offenders, which would be quite an extraordinary measure, where the province would be actually directing police on the administration of justice, which doesn't happen often, but can happen should there be a pressing public safety issue. And this is happening so often that these are discussions that are happening.
But it's interesting, number one, obviously it's just terrible that it's happening in British Columbia, but it's interesting to me that we've got a lot of the same statistics in Toronto and Ontario. Carjackings are up big time in Mississauga and Brampton, as an example, and it's just almost at epidemic proportions. And yet we seem to be sleepwalking to the election coming up next week. The municipal elections across Ontario coming up next week. Turnout was down dramatically in the provincial election, and most people think turnout's going to be down in the municipal election, and just really, really low. And turnout was up. And so, what is it about BC residents that are making them pay attention to what's going on and wanting change? I think it's interesting. And affordability was the other big issue, which we're going to take a break and come back and chat about with Sara MacIntyre in just 2 minutes. We're going to really focus in on affordability issues that unquestionably Vancouver's facing, but so is Toronto, so is the GTA. And so why are we sleepwalking when BC is wholesale change of their local city councils? Stay with us, everybody. Fascinating conversation. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga Night 60. My guest tonight is Sara MacIntyre. She is a political commentator, a political consultant, a communications expert. She actually advises firms on GR and PR and all that kind of stuff. She's formerly a communications person for Christy Clark, who was the Premier of British Columbia. When was it? A decade ago or so?
Thanks for aging me, Brian. Yeah, I was in the Premier's office. I think it was 2013 to 2014, was very long. And
you also worked for former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And one of my favorite pictures of you was dressed as Wonder Woman, where you were being the Wonder Woman for Stephen Harper and doing communications for her as well. And actually, I was reaching out to you. We didn't connect because I understand you met Queen Elizabeth, and I was hoping to get a viewpoint from you when obviously we had the funeral and the passing of Queen Elizabeth, and you were, I think, very impressed with her when you met her and you convened. Didn't you organize a tour or something?
Oh, I did not organize a tour by any means. I was the one lowly staffer from the Prime Minister's office that attended all of her events during her Jubilee tour of Canada, which was her last visit to Canada, and celebrating her time on the throne. And it was remarkable to me, the schedule of events that she would maintain during her tours. And, you know, you think of Canada, you think of just the time zones alone, getting from places to place and getting up to back onto the proper time zone, and then having evening events first thing in the morning, and she was always gracious. And I can't really say I met her. I mean, I was presented to her at the end of her tour as kind of a thank you from the Prime Minister for working those events. But I mean, yeah, I can't say anything that anybody else hasn't already said more eloquently about Her Majesty and her time on the throne, and her years of service and her example as a true public servant, and how she took the role of the crown and tried to bring it to as many people's lives as possible.
I had the pleasure of meeting her when I was 16 years old. And
wow.
It was an incredible experience. I was a young liberal at the time. I know you'll find that shocking and terrible, but I was a young liberal at the time, and I was on a provincial organization, and I was invited to meet the Queen at the opening of the Olympics in Montreal, and met her. I met Prince Philip, met Prince Charles, now King Charles. And ended up having really quite a short conversation with Queen Elizabeth, but a long conversation with Prince Philip, which was really fascinating for me because he served on a war munitions board with my grandfather, which was kind of interesting. Anyway, different topic for a different day, but I think it would have been great to have chatted with you at the time. Sara, you know, it's interesting to me that affordability became such a huge issue in Vancouver. And not only in Vancouver, in from what I understand, numerous different cities around British Columbia. And, you know, we've had lots of conversations about affordability or the lack of affordability in housing in Ontario. And people have talked about it and complained about it, but it doesn't seem to have really changed much and resonated much with the electorate. What was it that shook things up such that you had wholesale change of the City of Vancouver Council? And as you pointed out, the new mayor has got some pretty aggressive plans for, increasing housing and, frankly, supporting developers and supporting single family housing dwellings that will give them as a right to opportunities to convert into laneway housing and basement apartments and mother-in-law homes or whatever you call it. So doing a lot of those things that some people have been talking about for a long period of time in Ontario about creating that opportunity for what some people call the missing middle, which is, the extra homes that we need in our established suburban communities or urban communities. What is it that caused this attention to affordability?
Well, I think you know, if you like, housing in Vancouver has always been, you know, leading as, you know, the most expensive in the country for decades. And everyone's like, oh, this bubble's going to burst. Or it's, you know, at one point there is a suggestion that it was all foreign ownership and that there was a bunch of homes that are being bought as investment properties that are just sitting empty. And there is some truth to that. I think there's some stats that they're saying that a third of the homes that are being purchased are investment properties in the Lower Mainland. So what does that do for affordability? Well, it squeezes out the first-time home buyer. So, I mean, we do have a pretty high level of home ownership in Vancouver. I think it's about 60% own their own homes in the Lower Mainland, which is quite high. But I think what was the tipping point is, you know, interest rates went up, and all of a sudden those people that thought that they might be able to get into the market, even if it's in a surrounding urban area, so, you know, not downtown, all of a sudden those opportunities completely dried up. And so the hope of, you know, the next generation always doing better than the current generation, you know, that dream is kind of drying up. And you know, couple that with the rising cost of food and fuel. I mean, we hit $2.50 for fuel, a new record here in the Lower Mainland. So, and Kennedy Stewart, the former mayor, was proposing a road tax. So if you were bringing your vehicle into the city, if you lived outside of the city, you'd be paying a fee to bring your vehicle in. So very different visions for the city in the future. And I think part of the other issue is that there's been a lot of ground ceded to the NIMBY movement in Vancouver, and now there is a tide turning on that if we want to have affordable housing, if we want to have attainable housing, we have to increase density, which means we have to deal with this NIMBY issue, which means we have to provide some options and solutions that are affordable, that are in the downtown core. And the only way to do that is not just simply with developers, but you've got to work with your existing housing stock and make it much more efficient.
You know, it's interesting based on, again, I'm reading sort of Toronto media trying to interpret what's going on in British Columbia, which is obviously not as good as talking to someone like you. But it seems like the last mayor and the last council was focused on just social housing and not necessarily housing for everybody, and restricting it, giving into NIMBYism, as you've identified, restricting the amount of development, which meant that there's less home supplies available. And so therefore, housing affordability for everyone became worse. And this new mayor and the new council are, according to the papers, still focusing on affordable housing for low-income people, social housing, but more importantly, just wanting to build more homes and increasing the supply and making it easier. And he's actually quoted as saying that he wants to make the time to get approvals far shorter. Which would be, you know, gold to the ears of developers, because CMHC has said that the Greater Toronto Area is one of the slowest places to get approval of homes. Did this actually resonate with people? Did they think about, you know, that we're just not building enough homes, we're not building enough condos, we're making it too difficult for developers to actually build, and we need more supply?
Yeah, I mean, I think people realize, you know, I think particularly after that red herring of foreign home ownership was kind of knocked out of the park, when there was a study that was showing that it was, you know, the housing crisis in Vancouver wasn't because people were, you know, laundering money through the real estate market. There was an inquiry into that, and it's kind of proven to be, you know, a very little impact on the overall price and supply in the Vancouver Lower Mainland market. I think people think, you know, obviously, what is the problem? There's not enough supply. But there's not enough supply of new housing, and it's also, which is, you know, new housing supply is still going to be out of reach for most Vancouverites, you know, based on the median income. So that's still going to be out of price. So we need other options in addition to new housing starts. We need to be more efficient and more dense with the housing stock that we already have. And so I think people are looking at creative solutions, and people are also looking at, okay, my kid can't go and buy a house. Well, could I, you know, subdivide my own lot and build a separate unit, gatehouse, coach house, whatever you call them, and my children can live there and start and be able to afford to buy that piece of property and get them into the market at a lower rate. And so people are wanting to see more creative solutions like that. And they also want to see more solutions. This isn't simply a municipal level problem. I mean, they're looking to, okay, how is the province going to help this with, are they going to change some of the municipal act to allow more fast tracking of housing without all of these applications and hearings and everything that's involved with anything that's a new development in the Lower Mainland. I mean, it's like you might as well just say you're going to build a pipeline. Just you got to be in it for the long haul, and you don't know what the outcome is going to be. It's that level of uncertainty. And so I think between developers, between the average homeowner, between the young couple trying to get into the housing market with limited salaries and interest rates going up, people want to see new solutions and less talk and more delivery.
But this wasn't just in Vancouver. It was, from what I understand, sort of throughout British Columbia. Is that the case?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, this isn't, whether it's Kelowna or Abbotsford or, it's the same trend we saw in many other parts of the country during the first days of the lockdown, is when people were like, oh, well, if I don't have to be in the office every single day, I'm going to look at buying property outside of the city where I can actually get a yard for my kids and my dog, and I'll just commute in 2 days a week instead of 5. And all of a sudden that makes it more feasible, and all of a sudden you're able to buy more house. Well, when everyone is considering that, then all of a sudden the demand changes, the price point changes. And so it's not just Lower Mainland, it's the interior, it's Sunshine Coast, it's the north. I mean, you've got the project in Kitimat happening. So that's putting pressures there on housing. It's everywhere. I mean, tell me a place where, there isn't a housing affordability issue in Canada. It's all just a matter of degrees, but it's being faced basically everywhere.
Even in Nanaimo, 2 incumbents lost on council. And incumbents losing in Ontario is like almost never heard of. It's almost impossible. The power of incumbency and name recognition seems so high. And again, it seems like it's people that were not anti-development. That's probably not the right description, but more worried about social issues than bread and butter issues that went down to defeat. Is that a fair assessment? Look,
I don't like making analogies between BC and Ontario, to be honest, on any front. I mean, we don't even have a Conservative Party here, really. Like, BC is always, it's your own unique, brand of politics and issues here.
Admit it, you do have a Conservative Party in British Columbia. It's called the Liberal Party, but it's a Conservative Party.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean, Brian. And it's being called the Liberal Party for now. It's changing its name apparently under shortly to BC United or something.
I was president of a Liberal riding association in West Vancouver, believe it or not. And so I knew the people very well. And it was not a Liberal Party, even though it was called a Liberal Party.
I know, but you're making my point for me. BC is different. That's what my point is.
No, but what I'm trying to do is a lot of the same trends of public safety and affordability are occurring in Ontario. And, maybe I'm wrong, but, lots of Toronto media are focused on what's happened in Vancouver and the Lower Mainland and across, and even in the interior, Kelowna, as you mentioned, where you've seen higher turnout in a municipal election and wholesale change.
It's not even 40%.
Oh, no, it's low. There's no question, but it's higher than it was 4 years ago.
Not much.
It's up by, I think it was 4 points on 20. So that's like a 20% increase. It's massive. It's small in actual percentage people terms, but it's a massive turnout now. And one of the articles that you and I have exchanged was an argument that some people are saying is that the parties actually make it easier because people don't really understand what different people stand for, what their policies are, what their ideology is when they're just running as an individual. But when they run as a political party, the ABC party, the A Better City party, you get a sense of what the policies are about. And clearly a sizable majority of Vancouverites supported that party's policy. So Do you think the existence of parties in the Vancouver municipal election assisted in this slightly higher turnout and this wholesale change?
Well, the existence of parties have been in municipal politics in Vancouver for decades, Brian. It's not a new phenomenon. And the ABC party is only in Vancouver. It's not that the ABC party ran slates in other municipalities. Here's where I say what is different, and where I do agree with you, is that, okay, so if you were a voter in Vancouver election, you went in, just because we only talk about, the top 3 mayoral candidates, there was 15 mayoral candidates. And I think there was something like 64 names for councillors. So we don't have a ward system here. So you're not just voting for your city councillor that would represent your geographic area. You're voting for every single seat on that council. So that means that the names in the ballot and the choices is just, it is overwhelming for people, and they may not recognize names. And they've done studies here in British Columbia where they show that actually, if your name is alphabetical, if they rank the ballot alphabetically, and your last name is closer to the top of the alphabet, you're more likely to get voted, because people just get tired and they just vote for the people that are at the top of the list. Now, they've adjusted for that in recent elections by doing it on a random basis. But here's where the difference is with a political party, is because there's such limits on election campaign spending and marketing and advertising, that if you pull your resources together, you're able to do better and more impactful media buys. So, for example, the ABC party, you heard them on 980 all the time, which is the talk radio station here in Vancouver that everybody listens to. You heard the ads there on, and people that listen to talk radio are generally more inclined to vote. So all of those things have a big impact on whether or not people are going to get out and vote, and who they're going to vote for, and what name they're recognizing. So oftentimes, if people recognize a name recognition is a big thing, then they'll vote for that. Which is why in Ontario, the incumbency rate is greater, but it's also the ward system in Ontario too. So you only have so many people that you're voting for per your geographic ward plus mayor. So I think that there's some similarities and some differences, but I also think that we haven't had a provincial election, whereas in Ontario you had a provincial election, and I agree with you. It was kind of a nothing burger of an election. A nothing burger, yeah. Everyone knew who was going to win, and Doug got even a greater return than he did the first time he was elected. And people, I think, were at that time, in June, really just hoping and happy that life was returning back to normal. There was some normalcy going on, and they were sick and tired of politicians, to be honest. We were seeing all levels of politicians every single day on our TVs and over a thing, and they just wanted them to be gone. And so if you notice, leading up to the provincial election in Ontario, you saw a lot less of Doug Ford than you did a year earlier. And part of that is because, people had were out of patience with politicians, and really just wanted to get back to their lives and have some sense of normalcy. And so I think on the municipal side of things too, that in some degree there is that just kind of fatigue with politicians and political issues.
There appears to be in Ontario, Toronto for sure, and both the Globe and the Toronto Star had major articles this past weekend. One of them had like 4 pages on John Tory and the Toronto race, but it was almost as if no one cares in Ontario, and politicians provincially, municipally, are going to be reelected just because no one cares, and they're going to be sleepwalking to the ballot box, while BC seems to be different. And so what I'm trying to do is explore why BC is different. Anyway, we're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Sara MacIntyre, political commentator from White Rock, British Columbia, in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having an interesting conversation with Sara MacIntyre, who is a political commentator, political communications expert, a activist within politics for a long period of time. She used to work for Christy Clark, the premier of British Columbia. She used to work for the former Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, all in communications and public relations area. She runs her own consulting company right now, doing public relations and government relations and things like this. And she's in White Rock, British Columbia. She's now a resident of British Columbia after being a resident of Ontario. And I'm trying to find out why the BC elections municipally that occurred this past weekend changed things dramatically. And yet in Ontario, it doesn't appear that we're going to be changing much, if anything, at least given what most of the polls are suggesting and the media is suggesting, that, you know, attention interest is low, and we're not going to go out to the polls. Turnout's going to be even worse, and incumbents are going to win without having to work very much for it. And as I've said a couple of times, people are sleepwalking to the polls. And so I'm trying to challenge Sara in that regard to try to figure out what's going on. And before I go back to you, Sara, I just want to share with everyone, you know, some of the press that's been talked about this past couple of days, where new mayors were elected supposedly in all corners of British Columbia as voters call for change. And they've made big promises, and the promises are on housing and transit, and making it quicker and easier for developers to get approved. Still focused on some social housing and safety issues, but it's to accelerate permitting in order to address a lack of housing, double the number of co-op housing, and supportive of controversial plans in Vancouver that will increase density, particularly around transit stations. This is something that, you know, some people in the province of Ontario and the city of Toronto and other cities around the GTA have been saying is needed. CMHC came out and said we need 1.8 million more homes in the Greater Toronto Area in the next 10 years than would otherwise be built. But it seems like no one's paying attention. So again, Sara, is there something different that made Vancouverites, made British Columbia residents pay attention to these issues that for some reason in Ontario we're just not paying attention to?
Well, I mean, I'm not a psychologist and don't have the sentiment of an entire province down after being back for 2 months. I don't want to overstate my qualifications for reading into the sentiment of the BC populace and electorate. But I do think that there is something to the fact that, you know, you had in Vancouver and in many parts of this province, you know, and also provincially, a very hesitant for new development, new housing projects, new development projects at all. You know, it was seen that development was, you know, the cause of some of these problems, and you know, things have just gotten obviously exponentially worse over the past number of years. And so I think there's part of that, but I also think that there's, like, you know, in BC you haven't had any voter test or contest since the pandemic has begun. And so I think people were frustrated about a lot of things that happened during the pandemic, and we're all still feeling the consequences of that, whether that be inflationary food pressures from the war in Ukraine or supply chain problems. And I think that they wanted to have an impact on having a change in the direction. Okay, we've tried this for this amount of time and it didn't work. Now let's try something else. And there is something with respect to a party system at a larger metropolitan area in the sense that you can get things done. I mean, part of the problem in Toronto constantly, and you know, before the last municipal election, when the premier cut the number of councillors down at the city of Toronto, is that it's just because there is no alliances between certain members work together, but there's no commitment, there's no shared vision or values or priorities. And so getting anything done at the city of Toronto is kind of hopeless. And so people think maybe it doesn't matter who's on council because nothing gets done anyway. I don't know. I can't say that I have the reasons or the answers to any of this, but I do think like this has been the first political contest people in British Columbia have been able to go out and have their say in since, some pretty massive disruptions to everybody's lives and the consequences of that we're still living.
Let's go and take a look at another news source just for a second here. BC election results. 6 interesting facts about the 22 election, where new faces could mean big changes for TransLink, which is the big transit organization comparable to Metrolinx, as voter turnout reflected in municipalities that voted for change. And these 6 facts are interesting, that there was no vote splitting woes. And so therefore you actually had, because of the political parties, you had, a fairly sizable vote for the winning candidates, rather than people that too often in Ontario politics get elected with 32%. You had people that actually, had to get over 50%. Change came not just in big cities, but in small cities too. New faces that could mean substantially new plans for transit and expansion of transit. And interesting enough, the new mayor of Vancouver, for the first time in 42 years, beat an incumbent, which has never happened before, or it hasn't happened for 42 years. And so, incumbents can lose if you have the right policies and the right campaign, and maybe political parties to get ahead of them. And then in 4 other cities, the 4 big cities, turnout was up. And, turnout in Ontario for municipal elections is down in the 20s. Here you had Vancouver at 37%. 32% in Surrey. Something happened in Vancouver. Something happened in British Columbia with public safety and affordability that got people to come out and vote, and importantly, vote for change. Now, Sara, you have been a resident of Ontario as well. You've been involved in politics in Ontario as well. You mentioned that the Toronto City Council doesn't seem to be that functional at times, and Premier Ford has put in place some things like the strong mayor system to try to empower them. What else do you think needs to happen? What needs to change to get voter turnout up, to get people more interested? Or are we just bored with politics and politicians and don't care?
I mean, this has been a perennial question everyone's asked, and this isn't a new phenomenon that municipal voter turnout is low. It always has been. It's the poor cousin. It's just for some reason that municipalities and municipal issues are the ones that touch your life every day. It's like, when does the recycling come, and what's your property tax, and is there going to be a giant a high rise beside you, or a park? Where's the school going to be? Where's the park? All of these things that touch your life on a very intimate and daily basis. And yet,
more than provincial issues or federal issues. When you think about water, when you think about roads, when you think about transit, when you think about schools, it's a lot of the things that actually touch us day in and day out. That's municipal responsibility. Not, I don't want to belittle the provincial and federal responsibilities, but foreign affairs is not something we pay attention to every day.
No, and it doesn't generally impact your quality of life every day as well, whether or not the government decides to take a position internationally or not on a particular global issue. But this is a question that's always been asked. Every political scientist has studied this in Canada and in other jurisdictions as well. And the assumption, or the working assumption is that because it takes a smaller bite out of your paycheck, then the less that you pay attention to it. Or some of these jobs are part-time jobs, but not in Vancouver, for example. I mean, the mayor in Vancouver makes $180,000, councillors make $100,000, and they have massive impacts on the type of life that you're going to live if you live in downtown Vancouver, if you operate a business downtown. So yeah, I mean, this has been a question that's been asked many times, and I've never heard an appropriate answer that kind of provides a catch-all answer or explanation as to why people are less likely to go out and vote municipally, even though it touches their lives so intimately and so often.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't have an answer for you.
So I think it's 2 issues, maybe more, but I think it's 2 issues. Number one, I do think that the existence of political parties in Vancouver allowed people to coalesce around policy issues that make it very difficult to coalesce around a policy issue. And the only person that I've known, and maybe there's a couple of them, but the only people that I've known that have been able to coalesce around a policy issue in Toronto was John Tory, who talked about smart tracks in his first campaign for mayor. And that really resonated with people. And it was just one issue, transit. And it was great, great branding, smart tracks. And maybe, David Crombie, the former mayor, who's a distant relative of mine, so I can't take credit for anything other than his name. But he was a really, anti-development, anti the Spadina Expressway. And that resonated back, 50 years ago when he was running for mayor. But not a lot of other mayors or council candidates have been able to sort of coalesce around a policy issue. And I think the existence of political parties in Vancouver, this ABC party, really allowed them to coalesce around this policy issue. And then I think the second issue is that they were brave enough to actually talk about some of these issues. And I don't think many municipal politicians are brave enough to talk about issues. And, you probably know that the provincial government had this affordability task force in Ontario. They came up with 55 recommendations. One of the recommendations was this as of right ability that single family home owners would have to convert their homes into a minimum of 4 homes, nanny suites, in-law suites, basement apartments, places for the laneway suites, places for the kids, etc. The provincial government didn't take that one forward because they said that it would be political suicide. Well, that's what the new Vancouver mayor was willing to talk about. And similarly, the provincial government passed a whole bunch of increased density around transit zones, transit stations by way of ministerial zoning orders after the election, not before, and didn't campaign on policies to change that. They just sort of imposed it from up above.
Well, those are some of the things you have to get into. I mean, you'll see right now what's happening. So currently, provincially in British Columbia, there's the Ndp government led by John Horgan, who has announced that he's stepping down for health reasons, and who has extraordinary popularity still. If he wanted to run again, he'd no doubt get another mandate. But so now there's been a leadership contest for the NDP with 2 candidates. One's an outsider, isn't going to go far, I don't think. And the other one is David Eby, who was the housing minister here provincially. And he came out with his housing policy as a leadership candidate, which included a flipping tax. And it included that people would be able to have up to, I think it was either 4 or 6 units per on their property without having to go through a rezoning and permitting process. To try and provide the right incentives for people to have density within their own property lines, and a number of different things like that too. And I found it really interesting that he's putting those statements out there, even though basically he's going to be acclaimed if the NDP.
But that's my point. He's got some guts. Like, that's a very gutsy move that some people, some NIMBYs, may not like, but it's, I think, the potential solution to our housing affordability issue.
Yeah, there's going to be things that, no matter where you come down on this, you're going to end up with people that have very strong opinions and values on this. And the reason is because it has to do with their principal asset of their life, which is their property. So you don't want to have a high rise next to you, and therefore you're against density. And you want to maintain nothing, not in my backyard, or a banana approach, build absolutely nothing anywhere, because you're trying to protect the value of your own asset. So you've got, people's self-interest in their principal asset of their lives. And then you've got kind of societal issues like attainable housing. And the way that people got into the market 60 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, isn't how that those same thresholds aren't there for people that are trying to get into the market now. And so how do you level the playing field? How do you increase density and do that without knocking, without getting into some difficult conversations where you're going to lose some votes? You're not. And that's part of the reason why nothing's really changed in the past 20 years on this issue. I mean, Vancouver housing, we've been talking about this issue for, forever.
We've been talking about this issue in Toronto forever. We're going to take a final break for some final messages, and come back with Sara MacIntyre in just 2 minutes and see if we can bring this all together and try to solve this problem. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is the Wonder Woman of communications in the Conservative Party, Sara MacIntyre, who, and it's not a joke, she actually was called Wonder Woman and had this beautiful picture of her, cartoon of her as Wonder Woman when she was communications for Stephen Harper.
You always say Wonder Woman, and it was Laura Croft that I was doing that photo.
Oh, I thought, well, the same thing.
But I have lots of Wonder Woman stuff around my house and my office. I'm a big fan of the original Linda Carter, so absolutely. I'll take it anyway, Brian. Thank you.
Why? Why are you a big fan?
Well, I always was when I was a kid. I was obsessed with her, the truth lasso and the invisible plane, and she was so strong, and she didn't need anyone to help her get it across the finish line. It was Linda Carter. And when I left home to go to university, my mom gave me a Wonder Woman Pez dispenser to remind me that I could do anything. And that Pez dispenser has come with me on every single trip I've done in every place I've lived in. And so, yeah, I'm a big fan.
Well, I'll keep calling you Wonder Woman then. Anyway, Wonder Woman, you're a communications expert, and it's my hypothesis. You haven't agreed with me yet, but it's my hypothesis that something happened in British Columbia to increase turnout. Not dramatically, but significantly, such that you had almost wholesale change. The four major cities all changed their mayors, councils changed, and people paid attention to issues that they haven't paid to, that, as you said, people have been talking about for 20 years, but finally people had some brave solutions to housing affordability and public safety and transit, maybe a third. The articles that are writing about the Toronto race and other mayoralty races and council races in around the Greater Toronto Area in Ontario are the opposite, that we're sleepwalking to the finishing line, and that blandness, that moderation, that slow change, not being radical, not being strong in your beliefs in any one strategy is the right strategy. What do you think from a communication standpoint, if you're advising politicians? Is bland, middle of the road, incremental change the right strategy, or is it brave, aggressive, strong change?
Well, I think you got to play to the pulse of the people. I think we've kind of skated around this, but there's very different political culture in British Columbia than there is in Ontario. It always is for coastal communities. But Ontario, I do think I do think that there is some value or something to the fact that people have a bit of politician fatigue at the moment. Like, they're just done hearing from politicians, and that's why the Ontario election happened quick and fast, and it just kind of was definitive, and people are like, okay, let's move on, let's stop talking about politics, let's stop navel gazing, and let's just try and get back to normal. So I think the pulse of the people, you've got to be able to read what that is, and if it's kind of slow and steady and incremental. I mean, that's what we did at the Conservative level, right? We weren't having these big discussions on things. It was conservatism by incrementalism.
Sara, thanks so much for joining us and telling us a little bit about what's going on in British Columbia. I really appreciate it. I'm going to finish with my own point of view, if that's okay for everybody. I do think that we've got a problem in Ontario and the Greater Toronto Area, and housing. Affordable housing is a significant issue. CMHC says we need 1.5 to 1.8 million extra homes over the course of the next 10 years, in addition to what would otherwise be built if we want to have any semblance of affordability. Articles have said that TTC is close to bankruptcy. Metrolinx is challenged with revenue. We demand that our transit organizations pay a greater percentage of their operating costs than almost any other transit organizations around the world. People have said at Build, at CMHC, and other places that the Greater Toronto Area is some of the slowest to review building permits, zoning permits, etc. in North America. At the same time as we've got 430,000 new immigrants coming into Canada every year, with more than half of them coming to the Greater Toronto Area. And at the same time, which is interesting, last year, for the first time in almost recorded history, we had outmigration from Ontario, that people were moving from Ontario to Quebec and elsewhere. And I think they're voting with their feet, that there's something wrong here, and it's probably affordability. And there's been lots of articles about, garbage cans overflowing, lack of drinking fountains, lack of washrooms, infrastructure, congestion, construction nonstop on roadways. I think we got some challenges in Southern Ontario, in the Greater Toronto Area, and I don't think we should be sleepwalking to the election. And I'm not saying you got to just vote for new people. That's not the solution. But you've got a franchise on Monday, October 24th, to vote in your municipal election. And I think it's a responsibility, because this is the government that is closest to what we all do on a day in and day out basis, whether it's water, garbage, roads, etc. So do me a favor, do yourself a favor, do society a favor, read up a little bit and think about that vote. Just don't not vote, which probably 70% of us won't vote, which is too bad. Go out and vote, and think about who you want to elect as your mayor, and who you want to elect as your council person and your trustee for the Board of Education, etc. Don't do it just based on incumbency, and don't do it just based on name. Do it based on who you think will do the best job, and who's going to be brave enough, strong enough to actually change things when we desperately need some change. Desperately need some change. Things aren't perfect. Things are good. We're a great place to live. I think it's one of the best places to live in the world, other than Vancouver, which I have told many people is the nicest city in the world when it's sunny. The only problem is it's not sunny all that often. But when it's sunny, Vancouver is the nicest place in the world. But I think that we all need to take it upon ourselves to educate us a little bit more. And I've tried to do that. I've got about 10 different interviews with different candidates running for mayors and ward council positions. And I'm going to repost them again. Educate yourself a little bit if you could, and go out and vote for someone not based on just name, not based on just incumbency, but based on who you think will actually do the best job. We owe it to ourselves, our city, our children. Thanks very much for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every night at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from White Rock, British Columbia, at www.saga960am.ca. Sara MacIntyre, Wonder Woman, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.